it's time to sit back and relax with your favorite drink. And listen. The Cave. When I first moved to the small rural town of Gorham, Maine, I had little idea of what the town was like. I'd heard it was a pretty place, not all that popular, but the people who lived there had been bred and raised there, going nowhere else for decades. It was one of those types of towns where everyone knew everyone. I decided to move here a little less than 10 years ago. Now I'm counted as a regular amongst the group. But there were still secrets I hadn't been told. There are secrets you don't go prodding at in a group of such closeness and security, such as the ones about the past. Oh yes, the past is a popular topic, when gas was 50 cents a gallon or when you could get your milk delivered to you. But the past I speak of is a past that no one in this small town wants to be reminded of. Our legends are something that are often passed down from father to son, mother to daughter, daughter to cousins, and cousins to strangers met at parties. Disturbing stories get around, but none of them can be true. As the game telephone goes, a word passed around so much that by the time it gets to the end, it's completely different than from what it started as. The reason why I'm writing all this, and the reason why I'm even telling this story, is because it has no ending. Well, I'm confused to no end about what happened, and I'm hoping someone, somewhere, can make sense of this irrational child's tale, rumor sparking nonsense. It's been on my mind since it happened, even though it was back in 2008. Well, I suppose I ought to explain. The 23rd of September 2008. My house is on the border between Windham and Gorham, near the river. Buried in the woods, just slightly. One frightfully boring afternoon, I'd been told by a girlfriend that there was some walking paths into the deeper parts of the woods. Well, intrigued, I asked her if she'd come show me, and she came over not an hour later. We trekked out into the woods, snapping some beautiful photos of the reddening leaves and a few scattering deer. It was a beautiful walk, until we reached a part where the floor of the forest dipped very deeply. We tried to get down into it, but it was like trying to scale a wall downwards. We stood at the top and looked down over the hill for a while, trying to see if there was anything worth the stumble down. We walked around the edges of it, finding that it was like a little ravine. As we moved on, we began to notice something different about the ground. It had more rocks than other parts of the forest. I looked ahead, taking my eyes off my footing for a moment to see a small cave in the ravine. Water was trickling out of it, making a small river, and went about 10 or 20 feet before the small amount of water just disappeared. I looked back at my friend, whom I'll call just Andrea for now, with a look of glee. I pointed to the cave and said, "Oh, we need to get down there." She nodded and took lead, walking to a dip in the ravine that seemed to be less steep than the other parts. We staggered down it, reaching the cave within moments. Andrea took a seat on what looked like petrified wood and took a drink of her water, while I investigated this amazing find. I stood in front of it to find that it was shorter than me, but fairly wide, about elbow to elbow and up to my collarbone. The light that shined in showed that it wasn't very big inside. It dipped in and became very tight. But the most unique thing about this cave is that it was made out of stacked and plastered stones. I snapped a few shots of it, feeling very excited. Oh, my kids would love to see this, I was thinking as I took a step in, ducking my head down. Well, disappointment caught on, though. We were hours into the woods and I had no flashlight. A frown came upon my face, but still I took photos of the interior. It was wet, dripping and cold, and a shiver raced down my spine. A slight blow of cold air came from the cave, like a soft, tired exhale, and an even softer noise followed. Over the dripping of the water, I could hear a small, short hiss. It was just a second, and the sound was near silent, but I heard it. I backed away from the cave, taking a final photo before turning to Andrea. She smiled at me and said something about farmers making tunnels that went under old roads to irrigate unwanted water to another place. She said it would explain all the loose stones up above us. Well, I nodded in response, trying to look interested. But I wanted to get into the cave. I couldn't explain it, but I just wanted to find the end of it, and just admire and probably be the first person to ever go in there. It was thrilling, but it was getting dark very, very quickly. Well, excited as hell, I turned to Andrea and said we should come back tomorrow. She responded that she had a counseling appointment in Portland, but I could go myself if I wanted. I said I would, and we left the cave, hiking home. It was pitch black when we stepped out of the woods, and Andrea raced to her Ford Explorer, jumping in it with a slight wave and a very rushed, loud goodbye. Well, she had to get home in time for her show, and drove off. Well, I stood there in the driveway a moment, hand still up, waving her goodbye, but fingers no longer moving. Well, I was a bit shocked by her suddenness, but I didn't hold on to the memory long. Well, the walk home was uneventful. Just to say that, well, I noted that Andrea said nothing and looked anxious the entire time. When I got home, I uploaded the photos onto my laptop, looking at them all with glee and interest. My favourites were of the cave and all its beauty. I flipped through the photos until I decided I should head to bed if I wanted to get out there early. As my computer was shutting down, I thought about what Andrea had said about the farmers making caves for water, and somehow I believed that was what it was for, but it seemed like it held a higher purpose, like it was for something much more important than just some water and stones. I wanted it to be an amazing hideaway, where a murder had been committed and someone else's bones still lay there, waiting to be discovered. Goosebumps popped up on my arms and legs, and I ran for the phone. Oh, someone had to come with me, and if not Andrea, then someone else. I had to share what I was going to find, and make sure everyone believed me. I phoned another friend, my daughter's best friend's mother, and asked if she wanted to go hiking. Well, she gave me permission to use her name here, so Carol asked where we were going to. I told her about the old path behind my house. There was a long pause before she quietly replied with, sure, and said she'd be over tomorrow at 9 a.m. As I lay in bed, staring at my ceiling fan, something reminded me that Andrea had been out of counseling for 2 years. Contemplating this, I turned to my side, looking to the doorway. I remember seeing my bag where I'd set it down, but it was on its side. I figured I'd knocked it over while closing the door. Not much after that, I fell asleep. But my sleep was dreamless. Carol arrived a bit late, 9:27, but she said her youngest son Aaron had the flu and she had to wait for her husband to get home to watch him while she was gone. We set out for the cave at 10:39, and the trip was, once again, uneventful. When we reached our destination, Carol said she wasn't feeling good and was going to stay on the top of the ravine. I went down, though, venturing to the entrance of the cave. Well, I checked and double-checked to make sure that I brought my camera and flashlight that morning, whilst waiting for Carol to show. Well, before I got down and dirty, I shrugged my backpack off and brought my headlamp, flashlight, and camera out of it. My cell phone was already in my pocket, though I doubted I'd need it. Carol would hear me if I yelled, I was sure of it. I stuck my head into the cave, listening carefully. I heard nothing but droplets dripping into the puddles and a small rush of water. I turned my flashlight on, aiming it into the cave. Well, the first view of the cave made my jaw drop. It was tiny, very tiny. But I could see very far back, noticing that it either ended or took a sharp right. I took my first few steps into the cave, ducking down as I began to crawl. My hands were on slick, dirty rocks, and the angle at which I had to crawl made my bones feel like crumpled paper. It was like being crouched on my feet, but my legs spread apart so I didn't get my boots into the water. I found loose stones and some mounds of dirt to maneuver my way into the cave. It was very uncomfortable and slow progress, but I managed to get a dip into the cave before I had to pause. I decided to turn off my flashlight and hook up my headlamp, since I'd be doing a lot of hand grabbing instead of flashlight aiming. At this point, I could turn around and see Carol outside, and the trees. I was maybe 8 or 9 feet into the cave. Took a few photos of the plastered stone, slung my camera back around my neck, and then tried to duck under the dip in the rock, finding that I'd have to go prone to get under it. I sat there a moment, hands partially under the dip, and my head near the same place. I wondered if it was worth getting soaked for. And the floor was wet, water trickling under me. I thought about it for a moment, then remembered I was wearing a windbreaker. I tugged it off, setting it where I'd have to crawl, and quickly went under. I held my flashlight and camera in front of me, trying to find a place to set them so I could move without being held down by them. There was a small crevice in the rock, and I shoved my flashlight into that and hung my camera around the hilt of the light. I squirmed, feeling my back grind against the ceiling, skin being torn up through my shirt. But the little struggle was over in seconds, and I was able to sit up on the other side. I paused a moment, turned, set a random stone on my windbreaker so I'd have a way to crawl back through when I returned. I took my camera and flashlight, looking towards the way I'd just come. I could barely see the light coming from under the dip, and the darkness seemed to swallow me up if I looked away. I turned my headlamp to the shadows and started my awkward crouch crawl again, but at a higher level than before. More anxious than excited now, I headed on. By now, I'd been in the cave for 10 or 15 minutes and was about 14 feet inside. The further I went, the more silent it became. The sound of birds was silence, the ambience of the forest gone. All I could hear was trickling water, my laboured breathing, and the shifting of stone and sand beneath my feet. It was a thick silence whenever I stopped to catch my breath, a warm, gross, thick silence that made everything feel heavy. Oh, the cave smelled dank, like rotting leaves and rust. If rust even has a smell, but I feel like it's the only thing I can compare the metallic smell to. No, it wasn't blood, I knew that. It was too pungent to be blood. But the smell made my nose burn, and it smelled good in a really weird way. You know those smells that you know smell terrible, but you want to smell more? Well, at about 27 feet in, I found that the cave was getting a bit taller, but less wide. I had to really squeeze my way through at some points and worm my way around tight spots. My back soon became sore and throbbing with a tiny sharp pain from all the scrapes and cuts from the stones. My hands and knees were covered with slime and dirt, but I didn't let it bother me. I was getting close to the turn in the cave, and anxiety was soon beaten by excitement. Though this wasn't a good thing. Excitement wired me up, and I tried to move faster towards the turn, and I slipped a lot more than I'd done before. I always caught myself, but there were a few close calls where I almost smashed my face into solid rock. And the cave widened so I could nearly stand up. It seemed to be about as big as the entrance here, maybe a bit thinner. 35 feet in, and the turn was in front of me. I placed my hand on the corner and looked around it. The cave got much bigger, and I was glad to get to stand up. I saw nothing other than a small pool of water and a steady stream coming from the roof, which was about 5 feet tall. The cave looked to be about 7 or 8 feet across, and piles of stones were stacked in the corners as if left by people who were working on the caves. Well, I doubted it, though. I raised my camera to take a few photos when I heard the hissing, except it was much closer and louder than when I'd heard it outside the cave. It sounded like it was right behind me, which obviously scared the life out of me. I dropped my camera to my chest, and the straps came loose, whipping around to face the trickling water. With a loud splash, the camera hit the pool of water and sunk God knows how far. I stood in silence for a moment, looking hard at the other side of the room. I glanced around after a moment, my headlamp snapping one way and then the other, before I realized that I'd dropped the camera. I dove to my knees, thrusting my hand into the water without thinking. I went in almost up to my shoulder, but I still couldn't feel the bottom. I pulled out, looking close to the water with my headlamp, trying to see to the bottom. But there was nothing. My eyes met my own in the reflection in the water, and I sighed. The noise didn't echo, it just stayed right by my lips. Nothing in this cave echoed. Nothing. Just as I was about to turn away, I saw a black shape behind my left shoulder. My heart dropped, and I quickly turned, sitting on my rear. Nothing was there but a hulking tower of rocks, which I tried to take photos of. I chuckled nervously, standing up, wiping my hands off, and turning to the pool again. I bit my lip, glad that I'd left my professional Canon camera at home, bringing my digital one instead. But it was still $60, lost at the bottom of a probably endless pool. There was nothing to be done, though, so I turned the way I'd come, looking at the cave with developing anxiety. I was unsure about going any further after what had ensued. 40 feet in, I was having serious doubts about turning and going back, though, especially that hissing. As I stood there and thought, I wondered if the hissing was some sort of snake or bat. Well, it wasn't out of the question, but if there was some sort of snake in here, it was near harmless. Well, bats, not as common in Maine as in other places, but just the same, were harmless. So I adjusted my headlamp and turned to the path that I hadn't walked on yet. The next tunnel wasn't as wide as the cave, but it was still just as tall, if not a bit taller. The walls were smoother and made more out of a lighter stone than the rest of the cave. Just as I was about to step into this tunnel, my phone vibrated in my pocket. I fumbled for it, taking it out and shoving it to my ear. Carol was on the other end, a bit distorted. "Hey, you've been gone for like an hour. What are you doing?" "I'm not that far in. It was hard to get this far, but I must be in like 40 or 50 feet. I stepped further into the tunnel, looking deeper inside. "Look, I think I'm going to go past the cave and see what's above it." "All right, I'll keep going here," I said, pausing to listen to what she was saying. "Be careful, Camden. That cave could get confusing, or worse." "Worse?" "Collapse." Well, the word struck me, and I hadn't even thought about it before. "I'll be careful about those loose stones and curvy paths," I said, with a slight chuckle. Carol didn't laugh back, instead sighing. "Look, I'll see you soon." I pulled my phone from my ear, stared at it, and stuck it back in my pocket again. I pushed onward, stepping over a few bigger rocks that had seemed to have fallen from the ceiling a long time ago. After another 30 minutes of uneventful, straight tunnel, I found myself in another one of those rooms with stones stacked around me. There was no water this time, but instead a strange patch of gravel near the top right corner. It was squarish, but sort of rounded, and on top of it was a rusted, ancient shovel, driven into the gravel. Well, I can't really say shovel. It was more like a piece of metal with very rotted, very broken wood holding a handle on the top. Around the shovel head was what looked like an old, plaid hat. It looked even older and more beat up than the shovel, with a few holes in it, dirt and grime slicked across the entire surface. It had a hole where the shovel went through, as if it had been set on the shovel handle, but eventually rotted to the point where it couldn't hold its own weight up and had fallen. I stared at it for a long time, really hoping it wasn't what I thought it was. I turned from it quickly and hurried to the next tunnel, squeezing in and leaving the possible grave behind without any second thoughts. Well, the shovel must have been 80 or so feet into the cave. Travelling down the next tunnel was harder than the last, since it seemed that the walls were either incomplete or damaged. There were a lot more rock piles here, and dirt, and even some remnants of tools. I was becoming more and more confused, more and more anxious about what was going on. Andrea said the tunnel was complete, and it had been for at least 200 years. The way things were beginning to look was like whomever had been working down here had left very quickly and very suddenly. The hissing suddenly came to mind, and the shadow behind my reflection. Now, instead of being excited, I was becoming scared. There was something very much off about this place, and I was hating every second of it. But going back now would render me a scared little girl that had no stomach for adventure. So I pushed on down the corridor, wondering how long it would be before I came upon the next room, if there was a complete one. Before I could reach the 100-foot mark, I swore I could hear a shuffling, or partially muffled by my footsteps. I stopped walking, turned and listened hard. There wasn't a sound. My light pushed into the room that I'd come out of, which was a small hole in the distance. I took a step and then stopped. The shuffling started and then stopped. My stomach leaped and I turned, and I broke into a run. I ran blindly, leaping over rocks and anything in my way. I dropped my flashlight in a stumble and didn't pause to grab it, but soon I'd become very tired, and I'd slowed to a jog, turning my head over my shoulder to see the shadows moving behind me. My heart leapt in my chest, and I raced into the next chamber, slamming my back against the wall, my headlamp quivering as I stared at the tunnel. Air pumped into my lungs so quickly that my throat began to burn. My ears had popped somewhere along the way, and they burned more than my throat. I clenched my stomach, tears pricking my eyes. I was scared. Very, very scared. Even when my daughter didn't come home from 2nd grade that one time, I wasn't this scared. There was something in this cave with me, and I couldn't get out. I was trapped. I felt a lump rising in my throat, and I let myself cry, sinking to the floor. I cried hard and heavily, hyperventilating and coughing. I let out many wails of anguish, sometimes slapping the floor or kicking a loose stone. After my fit, I decided to try and call Carol to see if she could get me out somehow, maybe find an end to the tunnel. The phone was still in my pocket, thankfully, and I dialed her number quickly. It rang 4 long times before she picked up. "Camden, where are you? I came back to the cave entrance an hour ago," she said through the phone, but I just started blabbering about what was going on. Well, she was just silent throughout, and she said quietly at the end, "I know." I fell deathly silent. The only noise was my soft breathing, which had calmed down quite a bit. "I shouldn't have let you go in there, Camden. I shouldn't have." Carol's voice began to crack then. Back when the tunnel was first being built, it was for what Andrea said it was for, water irrigation. But something went terribly, terribly wrong. "Carol," I started, worry rising quickly in my chest as she went on, trying to convince myself this wasn't real. But one of the men was killed. Nobody ever found out how, but they found him stripped naked, hands and feet cut off and head missing. They buried what was left of him down there and continued digging. They uncovered something ungodly down there, Camden. But, well, it's always just been a story. Something to keep kids away from the tunnels. It was just a rumor and nobody believed it when they got older. Oh God, Camden. Oh God, it's in there with you, and I let you go down there. She began to cry heavily over the phone, while I just stared at the floor. And he explained everything. The supposed grave, the incomplete caverns and forgotten tools. Oh, it's okay, Carol. Calm down, I'll be fine. There has to be another way out of here, right? I said, trying to sound positive. I heard her hum an affirmative, and I sighed. All right, so I'll just need to get to the end and get out. It's going to be all right. Don't worry about me. I'll call if I need anything. Okay, please stay safe. And she hung up. I closed the phone and put it back in my pocket, sucking in the information as I leaned forward and turned my head to the tunnel. My heart was pounding, and my stomach was tight as a knot. My head was whirring as I began to steady pace into the next tunnel. Well, I must have been at least 150 feet in at this point. I went through several more caverns before I reached a sudden, jagged wall. I looked at it in disbelief for a long time, wondering if I'd somehow gone down another path without noticing. But I couldn't have, since it was leading the water all to one place. And just to be sure, I turned to go back, my light hitting a figure in the shadows. My foot froze mid-step, and I just stared at the figure. It looked human, but was hunched over, and had odd hands with fingers that split in half to be other fingers. Its chest was large, but its waist was smaller than my own hand. It was looking right at me, with a very strange, animal-like face. Well, that was all I could see before the familiar hissing sounded, and it disappeared. It didn't run off. It didn't jump from the light. It just blinked out of existence. I stared at where it was for at least 5 minutes in absolute fear before I murmured to myself, my tongue like sandpaper. What the hell was that? I licked my lips, letting out a very shaky sigh, my stomach doing trapeze flips, and not in a good way. But I took a step forward, making my way back the way I'd come, hopefully finding a second tunnel. Soon I found a fork, and I turned to the other side of it, walking down it at a faster pace than before. I kept picturing the creature that had been standing in the dark, watching me. I hadn't seen its eyes, and I wondered if they were red or black or some other evil color as I sped up my pace. I wondered if it had sharp teeth or dull ones, how many teeth it had, just to keep my mind occupied as I broke into a light jog. I could hear the shuffling behind me. Was it a person? Was it a monster? Was it even real? Was I just being delusional? I began to cry again as I started to run. I pushed the thoughts away as I heard the hiss, but it broke into an inhuman screech of rage. I began to sob loudly, screaming out whenever I nearly tripped or stumbled. I found myself running so fast that I could barely tell the difference between floor and walls, the colors melding together as I picked up speed. Its loud footsteps got closer and closer, the thuds making me wish more and more for a miracle. And that's why I'm alive today. A miracle. I saw a light. Well, it was faint, but there was a light. My heart began to race, and I felt that need to cover my rear and get away from the darkness. I was sprinting towards the light, inspecting the source to find it was a tunnel that went slightly upwards. I threw my hands out as I came close to the entrance, and I flung myself at it. My chest hit the opening, and I began to scramble up. Whatever was behind me wasn't far behind, because I could hear it growling and hissing with frustration. I whimpered and sobbed, climbing madly up the hole, seeing fading sunlight above me. A smile came to my face, but it quickly went away, turning to a wince of pain. My hands were cut and bleeding from the rocks, the knees of my pants shredded and blood seeping from them. But I was going to get out of this. Just as I threw my hand onto the ground, another hand wrapped around my foot. I let out a scream, the sound echoing through the forest. Birds scattered. I turned to look down, shaking my leg. There it was, giant bright red eyes glaring up at me, its teeth bared and grey tongue lolling in its mouth. It had pale, hairless skin that sagged and looked like the skin of an elderly person, but dark grey and slick with an unknown liquid. It hissed at me, snapping its jaws. I took my other foot and kicked it directly in the face, watching it writhe and snarl, but not let go. I clawed at the ground above me, feeling myself being dragged down, back into the tunnels. A rock was knocked loose, and I dropped my hand in time to catch it. I looked down at the creature, which was still looking right at me with its huge eyes filled with hunger. I lifted the rock above my head and slammed it down on the creature. It let go of my leg and roared that not animal, not human roar and tumbled back into the cave. I could hear its head smash against the floor and a rumbling sound come from that sickening crack. Rocks down below began to fall, and I hauled myself out of the cave, quickly turning on my ass to see the creature trying to get out. I shook my head and watched a stone fall right in front of it. The rumbling continued for a few more minutes before everything fell silent. I must have sat there for hours, just staring at the partially exposed hole. My heart was still racing and my leg felt like it was on fire. I looked down at it after I broke out of my daze, seeing that the monster had penetrated my skin and had dug its claws into me. I hadn't even noticed in my panic. There were 9 bloody lines in my calf from the monster's strange fingers. I leaned back and just let myself hit the ground, laying out in the middle of the woods, the sun going down and my leg bleeding badly. But I just lay there, forgetting about everything for a moment. In a state of complete and utter shock, I didn't move an inch. A noise snapped me out of my shock, though. A soft rustling noise. I sat up and looked around, and then realized it was my phone, vibrating in my pocket. I took it out slowly, getting blood onto the screen as I accepted the call, and pressed the speaker to my ear. Camden, I've been calling you over and over since the cave collapsed. Oh, I was sure you were dead. Oh, God, Camden. Carol yelled through the line, and I cringed, coughing. No, I'm fine. I'm outside a tunnel. I just barely made it out. I paused and then said, It's still in there. Carol didn't respond. There was a silence before I added, I'm bleeding. Some cuts on my hands and legs. I heard her sigh, and she said she'd start looking for me and to not move an inch. She hung up first, as she always did, and I stood, limping over to a tree, sitting down in front of it and leaning against it. It was half an hour before Carol found me and helped me home. She took me to the hospital, and we said I'd had a run-in with some hungry feral dogs. I was tested for rabies, found negative, and was stitched up and sent home. That was all 5 years ago. Today, Carol, Andrea, and I are still friends. My leg has some thick scars, and I moved to the other side of the river. Well, I was told by locals after my accident about the story. As Carol had said, there was a group of farmers who needed to irrigate some water and make a tunnel. Well, they dug it first, had a few cave-ins, but lined the walls with stone and plastered it together with some old-aged tar. About halfway through the digging, they uncovered something buried deep within their tunnels. It was a chest that they'd opened, thinking there was some ancient treasure, but found nothing in it but a piece of very old paper. They attempted to read it and brought to life something that lived dormant inside there for probably a very long time. Well, they had no idea until that man was found without his head and extremities. They continued to dig until they realized that they were being hunted by it, so they dug the shaft that I escaped from and never returned. And it said that there were 7 workers, and only 4 survived. First the door, then the light. Always shut the outer door before you turn the outside light off. That was the only thing written on the little post-it note left for me by the previous homeowner. I didn't think much of it at the time I discovered it. I was busy moving into my first home, had tons of boxes I still needed to move from the U-Haul into the house, and I couldn't be bothered to keep track of a scribbled-on piece of paper left on the kitchen counter. The last few months before the move had been a bit of a whirlwind for me. At 26, I'd just published my first novel, and it was actually selling pretty well. With money coming into my bank account in large amounts, I decided that it was time to move out of my 1-bedroom apartment and find myself an actual house. I also decided it was time to move out of the overcrowded city and give myself some space to breathe. So, I began to search for some property out in the country. It took a little while, but I eventually found the house. Not too big, not too small. It was just off a county road that led deep into farmlands. There were neighbours, but their driveways were about a 5-minute walk from mine. Not too far, but not too close either. The price of the place was very reasonable as well, far lower than what I'd expected. This raised some suspicions in my mind, but after numerous inspections and walkthroughs turned up nothing wrong with not only the house but the property in general, I just thought I'd gotten extremely lucky and bought the place soon after the last walkthrough. Now, the really great thing about the house was that even though it was somewhat removed from civilization, it still had plenty of decent creature comforts. It was a newer house, so electricity and plumbing weren't a problem. There is decent cell service, and the previous owners did some renovations to give the place a more rustic look. There are woods surrounding my house, but the tree line is a fair distance off, so I can observe nature without worrying that a storm will have nature come crashing through my windows. There are wild animals like coyotes and bears nearby, but I picked up a Remington 870 shotgun before I moved, and my wonderful companion Shadow, an almost pure black border collie, has always let me know when there are visitors, both welcome and not, to our abode. Shadow took to our new home like a fish to water. She loved to sniff around at all the new smells of the outdoors, chase squirrels, and explore with me through the many pines, oaks, and ashes that littered the woods behind us. We moved in during May, and the summer was an absolutely fantastic one. Friends came over, barbecues were had, many nights were spent stargazing. But then fall came. The trees changed colours, the warmth drained from the air, and the troubles began to appear. Shadow is very routine-oriented. Always has to have breakfast at a certain time, a walk at a certain time, and has to be let outside to do her business at a certain time. It was one night in early September that I noticed something weird that she was doing. During the summer, when she was let out into the backyard at night, she would wander past where the back porch light would illuminate, nose to the ground. I never had a problem with this because she always came back when I called. And yet, one night, I noticed that when she was let out, she wandered to the edge of the illumination and came to an abrupt stop. I couldn't see too clearly, but I did see her posture shift into one of aggression. Through the chirps of crickets and other noises of night creatures, I heard a low growl from her. This was surprising to me, as Shadow wasn't very aggressive. Sure, she'd bark whenever someone came to the door, but I'd never heard her growl at anything before. So naturally, when I heard her growl at the darkness beyond my backyard light, red flags immediately popped up in my mind. I keep a high-powered flashlight next to my back door, so I grabbed it and shone it out into the blackness of my backyard. Nothing abnormal was highlighted in the massive beam of illumination that came from my flashlight. Just grass, weeds, and the first line of trees that was the gateway into the forest beyond. I swerved the beam of light back and forth a few times, but still saw nothing out of the ordinary. In the minute I spent trying to see what it was that freaked my dog out, she'd done her business and was now coming back inside the house, seemingly relaxed again. I shrugged the whole thing off as a dog being a dog, closed my back door, and continued my night as normal. The next night, however, the strange ritual was performed again. Shadow went outside, went to the edge of the light, stopped suddenly, and began to growl at the night that surrounded her. Once again, warning bells went off in my head, and I grabbed the flashlight again. Scanning the surrounding area had the same results as the previous night. But seeing Shadow relax again within a minute and do her business, well, I thought it was just an animal scent from far away that Shadow could smell, but I couldn't. These nightly incidents did not stop, however, and after a week, I figured it was something Shadow had just started doing. I didn't pay it any mind whatsoever. Well, that came to an end on a night that a new moon was in place. The backyard was darker than usual, and the only light at all came from my back porch light. I let Shadow out, but she only went a few feet out of the door before she stopped in her tracks, ears perked and tail standing straight up. She lowered her head and began to growl lowly, her hackles standing on end. This night, I didn't have to wonder what was going on. My animal instincts were screaming at me that something was out there in the dark, and it was not friendly at all. Worst of all, I had the feeling that whatever creature lurked about in the abyss, it was watching us. Only a few seconds after I'd opened the door, I reached over and grabbed my flashlight, turning it on quickly and wildly swinging the beam of light through the murk. As the light crossed the tree line, I distinctly heard the sound of something scampering back into the woods before my light could reveal what it was. With the absence of whatever that thing was, my lizard brain calmed down, and I even saw Shadow ease up a bit, though she still went to the bathroom near the house and wasted no time coming back inside. I, however, stood still in the doorway, waiting to see if I could hear any sign of our unwelcome visitor coming back. After a few minutes of crickets chirping, night birds calling, and my nerves still being relaxed, I closed the door, shut off the light, and went to bed. Things were calm for the next 2 weeks. Shadow didn't get tense anymore going outside at night, and I was assured our troubles with whatever was out there were over. I even began to hang out in the backyard at night, with the back porch light off, so I could look up at the stars without any light pollution. That came to an abrupt end one cloudy, cold October night. Even though it was cloudy enough to cover both the moon and the stars, I was stubborn and decided to stick it out and wait for the clouds to dissipate. I was sitting in my stargazing chair, one of those chairs you can lie back on and it stretches out so you can actually lie back and stare straight up, and had been listening to a lo-fi channel on YouTube. I didn't have the most comfortable headphones in, so after a while I decided to give my ears a break and took them off. Silence greeted me, utter and complete. None of the nighttime noises I'd gotten used to were in the air, only the sound of me breathing and my own heart beating. In moments, my fight-or-flight instinct kicked into gear. I knew that nature shouldn't be this quiet, and the instinctual terror I'd felt weeks ago came rushing back into me with double the intensity. I scrambled out of my chair, disconnecting my headphones from my phone in my graceless tumble backwards, and was booking it for my back door. As I ran, I didn't hear any footfalls from behind me, yet I did manage to catch the distinct crunch of someone stepping on and crushing my headphones, assuring me that there was indeed something behind me in the dark, and it was coming after me. I got to my back door, thanking God I hadn't locked it, opened it, and stepped inside. I tried to turn on the back porch light, my hands fumbling in fear for a moment before I got it. In that moment, I knew the light had turned on, and before I had a chance to turn around, I heard something from behind me. It was the sharp rustling of grass and of earth being dug up. I turned around, grasping at the flashlight hanging beside me while trying to spot what had made the noise. Nothing was in the ring of light cast by my back porch light, and when I got the flashlight up and shone it around the yard, it revealed that nothing was there. As I stood in the doorway, scanning the night, Shadow came up beside me. She already had her hackles raised and began growling into the night right beside me. I knew something was up, and so I decided to call out. "Is anyone there?" I called into the night, not really expecting an answer. "Seriously, if someone's out there, I'm armed and you're freaking me out. I don't want to shoot anyone, but if you keep messing with me, I won't hesitate." Silence was my reply, with the slow ambience of crickets and nighttime animals returning at last. Shadow was much more relaxed as well, so I began to think I just scared myself over nothing. But then my flashlight beam came across something odd on the ground. Right outside of the edge of light created by my porch light, I noticed upturned grass and dirt, a large patch of it. I stared at it in confusion for a moment, wondering what it was, when a memory from childhood popped into my head. I used to play soccer, and sometimes when you were running fast and had to stop quickly, you'd dig your cleats into the grass, tearing up the field and bringing you to a halt. The patch in my backyard looked exactly like that, but I couldn't make myself believe someone had been silently chasing me in cleats. No, whatever had made that had to have been some animal, but animals don't wear shoes with cleats, so the closest thing to cleats some animal might have would be claws. The next day, I called up my local fish and wildlife agency. I described to them the incident and asked them what they thought it could have been. They told me it might have been a bobcat, but I insisted that it couldn't have been. I wouldn't want to tussle with a bobcat, but I highly doubt one could have invoked the primal fear that I'd felt. I asked if there was a potential for the creature being a mountain lion, but I was told we lived too far south for them. With some persistence, I managed to get them to agree that they would send an agent out near my area to investigate. Later that night, when it was time for Shadow to go outside, I grabbed my shotgun and loaded it. Shadow seemed a bit more at ease when she went outside, but I wasn't going to take any chances, and I stood in the doorway with a slug in the chamber, waiting for something to rear its ugly head out of the darkness. Nothing came of it, but throughout the entire time, I felt like I was being observed by something out in the night. Things went on like this for a few days, until one Saturday when I was doing a little gardening next to the side of my house, and I began to dig up the dirt underneath my kitchen window. I stopped when I saw strange impressions in the ground. Looking closer, I saw that they were a faint imprint of track, and following them, I found they circled around my entire home, always stopping at one of the windows, and then picking up again to go to the next window. My blood ran cold at this discovery. Not only were these tracks in no way human, as it didn't look like any shoe print I'd seen before, but whatever was making these seemed to have been profiling my home, and was smart enough to be going to my windows to check for a way in. I started to feel like a prisoner in my own home, and I did not like that. I decided to wait one night to see if I could catch whatever was doing this. That night, we did the same usual routine, but I acted calmly, like nothing was bothering me. When Shadow came back inside, I shut the door and flipped off the back porch light as usual. But instead of getting ready for bed, I shut off all the house lights, grabbed my shotgun, and waited by the back door. I spent a long time sitting in the dark by the back door, trying to remain calm through my anticipation of whatever was going to come skulking out of the blackness. Hours went by, and I was eventually becoming tired and had difficulty keeping my eyes open. The silence outside and the slow, steady rhythm of my kitchen clock ticking away was almost enough to put me under. Suddenly, a realization hit me, and my eyes shot wide open. It was dead quiet outside. No usual nighttime sounds, just like that night a few weeks back. I placed my ear against the door and tried to listen through it. For the first minute or two, I couldn't hear anything. My ears must have gotten used to the silence, however, as shortly after, I began to faintly pick up the sound of grass being crushed underfoot. It seemed to be coming from the left side of my house and coming closer to the door. It softly stopped, and as I strained to listen, a new sound cut through the darkened home. Light tapping, coming from my kitchen window not 6 feet away from my sitting form. The breath froze in my lungs. Something was at my kitchen window, tapping away quietly. I tried to crane my neck to see if I could see what was causing the sound, but from where I was sitting, I didn't have a good angle. I slowly began to shift my position to get a better look. With my shotgun, which I had forgotten was leaned up against the doorframe next to me, decided it had had enough standing up and chose right then and there to clatter loudly to the ground next to me. The tapping at the window immediately stopped, and I cursed myself and the firearm internally for being in the situation I was in now. I pressed my ear to the door again, but heard no noises coming from outside. I stayed like this for a good minute or so, trying my hardest to hear any noise that originated past the door. An idea formed in my head. Not a good one, but I didn't know what else to do at the time. Timidly, but loud enough for those close by to hear, I called out, "Hello." I waited with bated breath for a few seconds, but nothing happened. I waited apprehensively for a few more, and still there were no sounds. I let out a sigh, thinking nothing was there and maybe I'd hallucinated the taps on the windows. Suddenly, an explosive burst of sound came from the other side of the door. I distinctively heard the sound of clawed feet running up my back porch steps, and only had a second to prepare when something crashed heavily into my back door. The next couple of moments were pure chaos. Shadow was awoken and started barking from somewhere in the house. I was letting loose a stream of curses and cries of terror, and whatever was on the other side of the door began pounding on it. Through its banging, I distinctly remember hearing whatever was on the other side making a guttural growl that seemed to be a cross between a snake's hiss and a cat's aggressive yowl. In my panic, I grabbed my shotgun and got to my feet, pointing the gun at the door and crying out, "Stop it! Go away! Leave us alone!" Now, my old back door used to have a pane of glass about eye level to me, which is about 6 feet tall. As I stood there, quivering with fear, gun at the ready, a pair of eyes came into view from the other side of the glass. They were larger than any humans, and they were bright yellow, with slit-like pupils you see in a snake's eyes. When they caught sight of me, the banging stopped, and I could hear this thing's labored breathing. It was panting while looking at me, and some old animalistic instinct deep inside me told me those eyes were the eyes of a predator, and it was looking hungrily at its prey. I didn't know what to do. I was frozen with fear. Part of me wanted to shoot at the thing, but I didn't want to damage the only barrier that stood between this creature and me. I then realized Shadow's barking was a lot louder, and looking to my side, I saw she stood next to me, barking, growling, and baring her teeth at the thing behind the door. Looking back up, I saw the yellow eyes shift downward to look at Shadow, and the guttural growl again came through the door. "Oh, no, you don't," I cried, anger suddenly flowing through my veins. "You keep your freaking eyes off of my dog." No way was I going to let this thing that dragged itself from the darkened woods lay one clawed finger on my fur baby. I rushed to the door, turning on the porch light to get a better shot before going for the door lock with my other free hand, steeling myself to blast the bastard and fight to the death to keep my baby girl safe. It turns out I didn't have to. For the moment the porch light turned on, the eyes disappeared from the pane of glass, and I heard the most tormented and fearful howl I've ever heard from man or beast. I could hear the scraping of claws against my wooden deck, as whatever hellspawn that stood at the threshold of my house scrambled to get out of the light and run back to the safety of dark night. As I got the door open, I saw the shape of something large and tall, easily breaching 8 feet on 2 long, gaunt legs, tearing past the perimeter of light created by the back porch light, back into the pitch blackness of the surrounding forest. I didn't sleep that night, instead choosing to drink coffee with my shotgun in my hand until the sun rose. When I went to survey the damage in the morning light, I grimaced at the sight. My deck had massive, deep, gouged scratch marks in the wood. My back door had a large crack in it from where the thing had slammed into it, and a strip of my yard was torn up with the same claw marks that were on my deck. That morning, I called the local hardware store in town, about half an hour away. I explained the situation, leaving out that a monster had attacked, and saying instead that a deer had crashed into my door. and I asked if it was possible if they could get a heavy wooden door to replace mine, and if they could install it the same day. They referred me to a good contractor, who I called, and he said he could get it done today, especially after I told him I'd double his rate if he got it done. As I sat at my kitchen table, still shaken from the previous night's events, wondering what I was going to do tonight, I noticed a corner of a piece of paper sticking out from under the fridge. Curious, and looking for anything to take my mind off what I'd experienced, I rescued the paper from under the fridge and took a look at it. It was the note from the previous homeowner, the one I'd completely forgotten about. Its message about always shutting the outside door before turning the light off suddenly made much more sense to me. So did why the house was priced for so cheap. I cursed the previous owner for leaving me in the dark about this nighttime visitor. When the contractor arrived, he let out a long whistle as he surveyed the damage. "You said a deer crashed into your door. Must have been a hell of a thing chasing it to make those claw marks on your deck. You're lucky the door didn't break down. You'd have had a hell of a mess to clean up." I nodded glumly, feigning ignorance about the claw marks in my deck. As he was installing my new door, he noticed my porch light. "You know, I could run back to Earl's Hardware after I'm finished with this door, pick up a motion-activated floodlight and install it for you. I'm sure it'd help keep those nighttime critters away." Thank God for that man, because my brain at that time was so in shock, I hadn't even considered something like that. It seemed my nightly guest didn't like light, so a motion-activated light would keep it at bay forever. I thanked him profusely, taking him up on his offer. After that day, things went back to normal for a long time. Months went by, and even though I would tense up every time at night when I saw the motion light go off, I didn't find any tracks near my house, and I never heard a trace of the creature anywhere near my property. I even asked my neighbors how things were going for them, and if they'd had any nightly disturbances. Their answer was always no, so I figured my problems were all over and done with. That is, I thought my problems were over until the later winter months, when I began to notice the motion light staying on for longer and longer durations. Shadow began to get scared, even stepping a foot outside when the sun went down, and I began to see the familiar odd tracks in the winter snow. Every couple of days, I'd see them move closer and closer towards the house. I swear I even heard that low, hissing growl one night. It floated up on the wind when I lingered by the open back door, wanting to see the stars. That door was shut and locked the moment the sound hit my ears. I was feeling like a prisoner in my own home again, and I didn't know what to do. I couldn't find where the previous homeowner had gone, and none of the neighbors had anything like this happening to them. I thought the motion light was a surefire solution, but that was falling apart and I didn't know why. But then I found the note again, hidden under a pile of junk mail on my kitchen table. It still read the same ominous message it had when I first moved in, but desperation made me do something I hadn't done before. I flipped it over, and to my surprise, there was another message written on the back. "Shooting it just makes it pissed. Only bright light will drive it away. Don't use the outside lights too much, though. It'll get used to them." Now I think I may be in some serious trouble. Well, a couple of really creepy stories for you there to titillate you and whatever other emotion I'm trying to evoke on this beautiful Friday evening. Well, happy Easter to all of you who celebrate, and, well, lovely weekend to all the rest of you. Back again very soon. Oops, I'm trying to get my perfect hour-long video, so I'm going to have to stop talking right about now. Have a good one. Till next time, sweet dreams, and bye-bye.